welcome to Codisol 2024. I'm Bryan Hale, the chair of the conference this year, and I'm here with Dr. Guy Cook, who is Emeritus Professor of Language in Education at King's College London. He researches in three areas: discourse analysis, English language teaching, and literary stylistics. In stylistics, early work on literature and advertising expanded into a more general theory of the role of language play in cognition, social relations, and language learning. And Dr. Cook's work on English language teaching advocates the use of translation and students' own languages, and he is an opponent of strictly monolingual and utilitarian approaches to language teaching. We felt that both of these areas tie in fantastically with our theme this year, which is players on the world stage, from EFL classrooms to global lives. So I'm really thrilled to be able to have this interview with Dr. Cook today as part of the conference. So Dr. Cook, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
First, I'd like to ask about your career, which has explored some fascinating and seemingly disparate areas, from language play and translation in language teaching, to language used in food politics and some research related to language and animals. Are there some salient threads that link all the different areas together?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a good question. To me, of course, they don't seem disparate areas. They have a kind of way that they follow on and from each other and connect. But I can very well understand they might seem so to other people. But I think there is a kind of, there are a number of threads running through that kind of come back together and then go apart again. So I was initially an English language teacher in traveling in various countries around the world. So that's always been on my mind, the issues to do with language teaching, and I've been involved in language teacher education all through my career. So that's always been a theme in the background. In terms of my own research and interest, my primary interest was literature, really. I did a degree in English literature, and I continue to be fascinated by that. I got very interested in stylistics, which is the relevance of linguistics to literary analysis. And then from that, I got very interested in this question without an answer, which is, can literature be defined? And I think clearly, to me anyway, clearly, it's almost impossible to define literature, but it has some typical features. And from that, I went on to look at advertising. This was in a kind of golden age of advertising, for various reasons to do with development of media and so on, in the 1980s and 1990s. And advertising at that time was really quite poetic and quite artistic and had many of the features that literature has, but it's obviously not literature. So that became an interest of mine. And then, well, I say obviously not literature, but to most people it's not literature. And then I got interested in those issues which crop up in literature and advertising when people are playing with language and messing around with the forms of language and finding patterns in the forms of language and so on and so forth. And then it kind of came to me, if you like, that this is a very, very widespread feature of human life, that people do like playing with language. I had actually, in the 1990s, I had two small children, so I was surrounded by those kind of childlike features of language, you know, endless repetition and games and fictional worlds and all that sort of thing. And then I became interested in the ways in which adult life, although we take our adult lives so seriously, is also rather sort of saturated with language play, although we don't always call it language play. But there's a whole raft of activities that adults find very important in life, from kind of religious ritual to football chants or whatever, where you get the same features as you get in children's play. So then I moved on to this idea of language play as an important feature of our species, actually. our ways of thinking and our ways of behaving. And then I kind of got interested in political rhetoric and debates over the environment. And I suppose there the connection is a bit tenuous. But on the other hand, what's happening in political debate is that people are choosing the forms of language in a way that they think will push people into directions and opinions that they want them to be pushed into. So to me, I know that is a bit tenuous. But there seemed to be a connection there to me. And then I came all the way back to language teaching again, because I wrote a book in 2000, I think it was published 2010, on translation in language teaching, because translation is really a kind of, well, it is a communicative activity. Obviously, it's a really key communicative activity in the world, but it also involves a deep understanding of form. So that came back and connected with my rather obsessive interest in focus on form in language teaching and learning, in which I believe, contrary to the currents of my time. So it's all a bit of a muddle. It all sounds a bit of a muddle, but to me, there's a kind of a thread running through it, and I hope other people maybe can see that as well.
I can definitely see the thread there. And recently, I feel frustrated sometimes when people in political debate focus only on the politics, as though everyone's taking that seriously and not on the form of language. So I could see the thread there. Around the turn of the millennium, it seemed like language play had a really big moment. You and also other scholars were writing about it. Could you tell me a little bit more about what was going on at that time and how that moment of language play scholarship kind of came to be?
Yes, that's a rather interesting phenomenon. It's a long time now since the 1990s when there was that kind of resurgence of interest in play. David Crystal actually wrote a book called Language Play at that time too. Why it happened just then, I don't know, but I think people, including people in language teaching, got rather fed up with this rather dreary approach to language, as though I mean, this is moving on into the relevance to language teaching, which we may come back to later. But the really dominant ideology of during my career in language teaching has been some form of communicative approach. Communicative approach has been defined in all sorts of different ways by different people, and I think the pioneers of communicative approach had some very, very interesting approaches to language and language teaching, but it became rather misunderstood, in my opinion, or rather degraded, so that it became an idea that you should always focus on getting something done with language, some practical problem. And then it sort of mutated into task-based language teaching. So that general kind of functional utilitarian approach left all these important uses of language, which I mentioned in my answer to the first question, to brush them to one side, if you like. And of course, it's important to be able to buy a cup of coffee in another language or find the way to the station or all those kind of things, tasks, if you like. But that's not the kind of language that people value. People value things like songs, for example, poems, prayers, games, fiction. Fiction is not just highbrow novels, it's also soap operas and all that kind of thing. People tend to go for a fictional world whenever they get the chance, computer games, TV series, films, and whatever. So I think in the 1990s, there was just a bit of a sort of a realization that a whole area of language had got brushed to one side. And that, of course, is also very connected to the fact that literature teaching had been kind of, well, pushed to one side by the very pragmatic approach of task-based learning and so on, pushed to one side. And also, when it was included as a kind of, sort of concession. It was like, okay, we'll do a bit of literature. Whereas you know, in the past, when I was learning languages at secondary school, a very long time ago, you know, one of the reasons to learn a language was to read the literature in the original, which still is a motive, and a very noble motive for many people, I think. So yes, there was a resurgence. Ron Carter, who died some years ago now, was also involved in that, and he was also, of course, very interested in literature teaching. So it's not so surprising that these were the people who became involved.
I appreciate that answer, and I think that my own learners connect with a lot of what you just mentioned about the importance of pleasure and imagination and aesthetics in language learning. And I think for a lot of my learners in Korea, appreciating literature is, I think, a really deeply held goal of theirs in language learning. But it also seems to me that there's as much pressure as ever to focus on utilitarian outcomes. I think these kind of outcomes focus is becoming more prominent in Korea, and it seems to be incredibly overwhelming in other contexts and remaining so. What do you think are some of the challenges in moving away from that kind of mindset?
Well, yes, of course, there are lots of challenges. This utilitarian, I mean, there is a sort of deeper thread in the philosophy of education here, in, if you like, the notion of what a curriculum should be. And we have lived, we live in an age when utilitarian approach to education as a whole is dominant. So, you know, in universities like the university where I still teach a bit in, I mean, I'm retired, but I still do a bit of teaching at King's College London. It's typical of other British universities, and I'm sure the same is here the case in Korea, that everything you do is seen in the context of it. Will it get the students a job? You know, and I personally think that that is a rather sad turn of events in education, because people have to earn a living, and society needs people to do various tasks and so on and so forth. But I still think there should be more to education than just utilitarian motivations. Within language teaching, yes, I mean, I agree. We still live in a very utilitarian, this is you know, the language teaching reflects the more general picture in education as a whole. And we certainly still live in that time. And I think I've been involved in ideas about English language teaching for a very long time indeed, right, since the 1970s, really. I'm afraid to say. And I think the interesting thing is that really the big shift was in the 70s and 80s, and nothing has really changed all that much since. So the sort of fashionable movements that we have at the moment are really continuations of ideas that began then. So it's quite a big shift to demand people to move away from that. But, you know, of course, teachers have to work in the context of their employers, their schools, their governments, their curricula, and so on and so forth. So there's limited room for maneuver, but nevertheless, there is some room for maneuver for a teacher. And a teacher, as an individual in a particular classroom, can, you know, stand up for values other than the utilitarian, whether it's in English language teaching or in education more generally.
So you mentioned that there were different kind of possibilities within communicative language teaching, and maybe the more
Yeah, yeah,
functionalist possibilities took over.
yeah.
So I'm wondering, if the utilitarian focus had not been so powerful, and maybe communicative language teaching had a bit of a different focus, or the language play moments had overpowered the utilitarian approach a little bit more, how would you
Yeah.
imagine language teaching? Is there an alternate timeline where language play is more powerful in language teaching, and what would that be?
I don't know. That's yes, an alternative history, a different branching in the future. Yes, I don't know. But I think a lot of the problem is to do with these false binary distinctions. So if you go right back to communicative language teaching, the theory of communicative language teaching you've got this binary distinction between form and function, but it isn't actually all that convincing because I mentioned these kind of banal things you get in task-based language teaching, like can you buy a cup of coffee, can you order an airline ticket or something like that, where in fact the form doesn't matter very much. And one of the big problems for the communicative approach was that, you know, people can communicate successfully in limited circumstances and get the form completely wrong. So some foreign guest arrives in somebody's house and is very tired and wants to go to bed and says, "Me go sleep now, please," right? And the host understands this completely and shows them up to a room with a beautifully made up bed and all this sort of thing. Communicatively successful, but it's such a simple task. The problem is that if you want to do anything subtle or sophisticated or you know, just nuanced in a language, then the more you know the form, the better you can do it. So form is function. That's really the problem. And when you look at examples of language play, so for example, literary type language, but it could be just something less prestigious. This playing with language, and this was part of the theory I put forward in my book on language play, is a tremendous advantage to individuals, to societies, and probably to the species. So it's well documented among biologists that there is a relationship between play and general intelligence, right? So the more generally intelligent a species is, the more it plays. And we're generally very intelligent in some ways, although we've managed to wreck the planet, which is not very clever. But it's part of being human to play, and it's part of a child's first language acquisition to play, right, with the language. And it's part of our adult life to continue playing with the language. So it actually, you can't really divide play from useful things to do. They are the same thing to do. Playing is useful on a bigger canvas, and things like games which are not reality, right? Football. I'm not talking about, you know, trivial games or whatever. Football's a very big cultural phenomenon. Football isn't a real thing, but it's terribly important in society and construction of identities and relationships and everything else. So there isn't a clear distinction between form and function, or utilitarianness and playfulness and so on and so forth. So yeah, I don't think they're as different as they seem.
And when I read language play, language learning, that really hit me that so much of our time with language is taken up in ways that we can just look directly past them when we have a really functionalist approach, but they're right there and they're taking up all of the time and space.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So, as we've been discussing, you've been a persuasive proponent of moving away from some of the focuses or doctrines of language teaching of recent decades. As a teacher in Korea, I feel that some of those, for example, communicative language teaching doctrines never really have impacted the English language teaching that I see going on here in many classrooms. I teach in Korean high school, and grammar translation method remains really dominant here. And in Korean public schools, I see a lot of sometimes fairly mindless drilling and a lot of rote memorization. What kind of message would you give to teachers establishing a career in this kind of context?
Well, that's a very complex issue, because I think the key word in the question you've just asked me is mindless, right? So mindless drilling is bad, mindless grammar translation is bad, and so on and so forth. But not all drilling and not all grammar translation are mindless. They may be more more useful than seems at first sight. But I just want to make one caveat to everything I say about language teaching, which is that I think one of the problems with all language teaching theory, including my own, right, is that it assumes that learners are the same, right? So it's as though you know, this works for some people, so it works for everybody, right? I agree. I don't think that's the case. I think learners are very different, right? Some people, I was criticizing task-based learning before, but some people love it. I personally always liked, you know, focuses on form. I like learning paradigms of verb changes in French or whatever. Okay, and I think grammar translation has some useful function in that it gives a learner, including me, when I'm learning a language, it gives you a sense of control, that you know what you can do and what you can't do, and you know where you are in the language, and you're not being sort of bombarded with things which mystify you. And so for some people, not for everybody, grammar translation can be a good way to learn a language. Probably better to mix it in with something else for a bit of variety. And for other people, a sort of functional task-based approach is also a very good way to go about things. Not for me personally, but then I'm not everybody, and nobody's everybody. Okay, so that's one thing to say. But on the other hand, form-focused activities, let's take rote learning, for example. Rote learning has had a very bad press for some very good reasons, okay? So in Britain, and I think in many other countries as well, you get various very right-wing politicians going on about we need to reintroduce rote learning, and everybody needs to learn things off by heart. So that puts people who are not right-wing themselves, puts them off, and that's fair enough. But on the other hand, rote learning, when it's spontaneous learning of something that people really like, can be a very useful language learning activity. I mentioned songs earlier on. So everybody, more, I mean, if you, not everybody likes songs, but people who don't like songs are kind of by definition peculiar, abnormal, if you like. And I probably shouldn't use those words, I don't know. Anyway, the vast majority of people love songs, according to their taste. The songs I love are not the songs you love, and so on and so forth. But we know them off by heart, and most people know a lot of songs off by heart. Of course, the fact that the words go with the music and you associate it with certain places and times and people and so on will all help. But that is a kind of rote learning. So the problem with rote learning is what you're rote learning and how you're rote learning. Okay. So it doesn't have to be some kind of Dickensian authoritarian teacher who makes a child stand up and recite a poem that they don't really like in front of the class. It doesn't have to be that. It can be a very useful activity. And if you know something off by heart, for example, suppose somebody had learned a part in a play, that chunk of language in their memory is a resource on which they can draw. And I know that this is the case because I happen to like learning poetry by heart. And if I've learned poems by heart in French, for example, I can withdraw something from what I know and put it into active communicative use. So there again, there's an instance where you can't put things into compartments so much. So there are a whole load of activities which were outlawed under the auspices of the communicative approach. I mean, I couldn't list them all, translation, but that brings us into another issue I want to come back to a bit later, but also things like dictation, learning grammatical paradigms, etc. Okay. And of course, like anything, they can be done in a bad way, but they're not inherently bad, I think. So I'm sorry, I don't really go along with the insinuation that, say, grammar translation is bad in itself. It may have a bad history, but it can be a very useful thing to do. Best to mix everything together, I think.
No, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
And I think the mix is very healthy. And I also am not a big fan of task-based learning.
Okay.
I find that, especially in a class of all Korean speakers, if the task is new to them and exciting and involves some learning, they just want to do it in Korean. So then I become the English in English, please, police. And whenever I'm doing that, I'm just, no, I want to switch back to focusing on form. So
If
that's
I could just pick up sorry to interrupt you, but
Mm.
just pick up something from that. One of the other things, I wanted to say something about the other dogma of the late 20th century, which is that everything should be done in English if you are learning English, or whatever language it is you're learning. Everything should be done in that language. One of the things that ignores, and you just mentioned it by mentioning Korean, is the effect of language distance on language learning. So learning English for a Korean speaker is different from learning English for a Dutch or German speaker, where the languages are much closer. So this suffered from some rather crazy ideas in second language acquisition theory, that somehow the progress of second language acquisition was independent of which languages you were talking about. These were ideas put forward in the 80s and 90s by Stephen Krashen and other people. And they had a very bad effect, I think, because it does make a difference. Not to mention reading and writing, because this is all very well if you're talking about just speaking and listening, but if you're reading and writing, then it's a very different matter if you're used to using the Korean writing or some other very different writing system from if you are all using the same alphabet.
We'll have to get you to debate Krashen. He's been a speaker at our conference several times. He's a very popular
Right.
speaker. He's very influential in Korea.
Well, he's a good speaker. He's a good speaker. He's entertaining. Yeah.
We had both Krashen and Scott Thornbury one year, and they debated each other. It was a lot of fun. And Krashen conceded that maybe teachers can play some kind of role in language learning. So we all appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, they're both excellent speakers, Stephen Krashen and Scott Thornbury. So that must have been a very entertaining debate.
It was. Well, it would be just as entertaining if we could get you to debate either of them, I think. Well, I think we've just been covering some of this, but I really appreciate the focus you bring to the diversity and complexity of learners and their priorities and the ways that they might engage with language learning. For the past year or so, there has been a kind of obsessive discussion about generative AI, such as ChatGPT, and there are some other developments going on, technological and political, that can feel like really big changes in the landscape of language teaching and learning. I wonder if you have any thoughts or observations about language learners in 2024, and what do you think we as teachers should be asking ourselves about today's learners or noticing about them?
Yes, well, this is a very big topic. I mean, like everybody else, I'm kind of interested, but also interested in the development of AI and also alarmed by it and its potential for impacting on us in all sorts of ways. And if I could just start off generally, so AI has, I mean, this is all very obvious and everybody's saying the same things. AI has the potential to take over certain jobs, right? Actually, particularly, well, I mean, as we know that, you know, it can be a diagnostic doctor, it can be a dentist, I don't know, whatever, and also play pieces of music and write scripts and all this sort of thing. So, and we as language teachers and learners must wonder what can happen in our field. Well, automatic translation, AI, machine translation is progressing in leaps and bounds, and already reached a level that would have been unimaginable 20 or 30 years ago. So obviously the question then comes about, right? Well, do we need to go on learning languages? Because the time will come, in some ways the time has already come, when you can hold something up and, you know, it'll listen to the person you're speaking to and speak back to them. I say it has already come because I've had conversations in inverted commas with people whose languages I don't speak, where I have put what I want to say into Google Translate and pressed the little speaker button and held the phone up, and they've listened, and then they've said something, or maybe they have to type it still at the moment. Anyway, it's possible to have this kind of communication, and it has been for some years. I think the first time I ever heard about that was a friend of mine who was in a taxi in China, and he phoned up a friend of his who was Chinese, and just he'd say to his friend what he wanted to say to the taxi driver, and the friend would say it on the speaker on his phone, all of that sort of stuff. But I think the important thing is this, right? That doesn't replace us, because when you listen to a piece of music, for example, a performance of a piece of music, what you're interested in is the person who's performing it, as much as the music itself. So it's a kind of horrible decontextualization, a depersonalization of what is happening. And the same would be true in language teaching and learning. So it's a very, very rich interpersonal human experience to be learning a language with someone, for them to teach you or for you to teach them, and then for them to have the pupil, or you if you're learning, to have the ability to go and speak to people from another country and another language, and it works. It's communicatively successful. Okay, if a machine is doing this, it ceases to be interesting in a human sense. That's one thing, and then of course the other thing is that AI can do some human tasks like translating to some extent, but it's not doing them in the same way. I mean, this absolutely brilliant film, Ex Machina, which is one of the deepest commentaries on the fallacies of AI I think I've ever seen. I recommend it to everyone. Alex Garland's film, Ex Machina, really highlights this. You're not dealing with another human being. You're dealing with something different. And it's not the same, and it never will be the same. Although the problem is that people may come to think of it as the same, which will be a deep impoverishment, I think. Yeah, that's what I have to say about AI. And I mean, one could go on for a long time, but I don't suppose you want me to.
Well, but I do wonder whether you think this could bring language learning back to some of the focuses that have been more important in the past, such as literature or an aesthetic appreciation for language.
I suppose the whole debate throws up those possibilities. The idea that technology can take over in language teaching and learning is by no means new. So in the 1950s and 60s, there were language labs, where people sat and they didn't have direct communication with the teacher. They listened to tape recordings and spoke into microphones and so on and so forth. And then things like the effect of corpus linguistics on language teaching have kind of dehumanized it, because suddenly, it's not that human beings know what language to teach, but some computer program can throw up how words behave in that language and so on and so forth. So there's nothing new about it. And I suppose the issues that it throws up make people think more deeply about the human side of language teaching and learning, and that would be a very good thing, I think. But given the way that the world is going wrong in so many, many different compartments at the moment, I don't have much faith that that people won't be taken in, I'm afraid. A big concern in British universities, for example, and I suppose in British schools at the moment too, is what will happen to assessment with AI. So I think we're heading, in the university where I work still, a bit, we're heading for oral exams again, because you can't trust what's written.
Yeah, I think those changes are happening in Korea too.
Yeah.
Definitely, me and my colleagues have made some changes more towards like writing by hand and doing everything face to face. You've mentioned a couple of times the state of the world and that we're doing a lot of damage to the planet. I wonder if you have any observations about how this might relate to language teaching. I ask because one of our special interest groups is about um, it's about the environment in ELT and how we should be dealing with this in our English language teaching. So I just thought I'd follow up and see if you have any observations about that.
Well, I have an observation, but it's in danger of sounding extremely trite, but it's trite but true, as the proverb goes. I think that communication between people who are in other ways, in many ways, different from each other is or should be the key to, you know, a better state of the world. And if people can communicate the truth about what's happening to the environment and persuade through truth other people about this, then that can only be to the good. And of course, if groups of people who are at war with each other, literally or in conflict, understand each other better, of course, the world would be better. Well, we hope. I don't know. But language teaching and indeed translation, actually, if you go back to the really fundamental problem behind what we do in language teaching and applied linguistics, is that the world, different people speak different languages, both literally and metaphorically. So you can get two people who both speaking English, but they speak different languages in some sense. But I meant, some people speak Korean, some people speak English, and so on. So the various ways of coping with this are to learn each other's languages, or to translate, to be a translator and interpreter. And the peace and prosperity and good of the world depends upon language teaching, learning, and or translation and interpreting. And I might mention something I meant to mention earlier on, which is another sort of brooding dogma hanging over from the 20th century in language teaching, is the notion that it's best to learn a language in that language, rather than understanding the relationship between the two languages. And this goes on as well. This has not gone away. So CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, is an extension of this English only direct method approach from the 20th century. And I think it's not good for world understanding and for world peace if everything is done in one language. And I don't think the monolingual tendencies of the world towards English only is a very good thing in itself. So let's hope that will change as well.
That's an interesting point. We do have some CLIL, especially at the university level in Korea. Do you think that it has some role to play in a context like Korea, or do you really think that any content learning would be best for students to do in their mother
Well,
language?
CLIL has some unfortunate effects, I think. So sometimes the scientific vocabulary of a particular language comes to a dead end because everything is being done in English. But that's part of that is part of the fact that in the international community, science is now conducted in English rather than in several languages. But it also cuts people off from their own identity and heritage if everything has to be done in English. So, English happens to be English at the moment in history, but it could be another language at some other time. But language diversity is important in itself, but also so is identity tied to language as well.
I think
And
that's
talking about translation, of course, the quantity of translation into English and into other languages from English is totally unbalanced. So thousands and thousands of things are translated into English, but English texts are not very often translated into other languages.
And I think that's a limitation with AI too. It's often not translating from one language to another. It's translating everything into English and then back
Yes.
out again.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I thought the point about science was really fascinating, especially since I think there's been a push to include other points of view and other epistemologies like indigenous approaches to science into science education in the Anglosphere. Um, so I guess there are pushes in different directions happening, and maybe that's something for uh, um, CLI focused approach to think about and to consider. I guess in some contexts in Korea, the students are not only Korean, they're from there's a lot of international students in Korea now. So English is functioning as a lingua franca, but I think the points you raise are really important and maybe something for my colleagues who do teach content-based English to think about.
Yeah.
You've argued that teachers should not feel compelled to follow changing trends in applied linguistics scholarship. Um, and you've also said that applied linguistics is something that teachers might explore for its own sake. And I'm sure that you've been to many events similar to our international conference. So I wonder if you have any tips or advice to language teachers about how to get the most out of this kind of conference.
Well, I certainly do. I certainly do. And it's in tune with what I've been saying all the way through about utilitarian approaches to things. So I don't think one should go to a conference just in terms of it's good for my career or it's good for my job or it'll help me teach better or whatever. A conference is well, not all conferences, but good conferences are enjoyable events and they're social events and they're a chance to find out about things which are not apparently or immediately useful and just to generally broaden the mind. So I think in the version of this question you sent to me, you said, well, you just said it, didn't you? What tips would I have? Well, I'd say enjoy yourself. Don't feel guilty if you don't seem to be doing what the boss told you to do. Just use it as an opportunity to relax. And when you're relaxed, maybe you gain new knowledge, which may not be immediately apparent that it's useful, but it might be useful in the end. That's the sort of serendipity thing about the way humans behave and think, right? We often, some of the greatest discoveries are made by accident, right? In the same way, if we don't concentrate on doing what we ought to be doing, we may come up with some benefits which were unexpected, I think.
Thank you. I think that's fantastic advice. I think that's what made me fall in love with these kind of events and maybe drifted
Yeah.
away from that love sometimes, but I hope to reconnect with that kind of approach to conferences. Well, thank you so much. As I said, I'm thrilled, and I think that our attendees will get a huge amount out of this interview.
Well, that's very nice of you. Thank you very much. Yes.